Welcome back to another reading and correcting of a familiar death with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And today we are doing Chapter 12. Marlowe parked the car before the house and looked at it. It hadn't changed in the 5 years he'd been gone. A new coat of paint to refresh the gray outside was all, as far as he could tell. He wasn't surprised. His father wasn't one for unnecessary changes or for prettying things up. The house looked even colder now that he'd experienced Trembor's parents' house, an old home with a fieldstone foundation and fake wood siding that had been colored in places by the Cubs. He hadn't heard the story, but that first time Trembor took him to the monthly family dinner, there had been a long, bright green streak along the front of the house at about the height of an 8-year-old cub's hand. The inside had been pure chaos, sibling getting things ready, the cubs playing in the attic. Marlot hadn't been ready for that much life under a roof. By contrast, his house looks exactly like what it was made for, to protect from the element, keep what was in it secured, in place, controlled. Nothing about the gray outside walls spoke of life happening here. The inside would be more of the same. He tried to tell himself his parents weren't that cold, that they had demonstrated their emotions in some ways, small ways. He couldn't remember any. He could recall them standing next to each other, barely touching, maybe a nod of acknowledgement, but no real emotions in their face. Trembor's parents were all emotions. His father, Torim, could be poetic about his maids at times. He had no problem pulling one in his arm and kissing her in front of everyone. Marlot couldn't stop himself from wondering how different his childhood might have been if his father had been willing to do that. His reverie was interrupted when the black wolf stepped out with a pipe in hand. He leaned against the wall next to the door, placed it to his lip, lit it, and took a long drag. The gesture looked relaxed, but Marlot knew why his father was there. No getting out of it anymore, Marlot grumbled. His father didn't act like he'd noticed the car, but why else would he be out in front of the house to smoke instead of the back? That male never reacted to anything. If his voice could carry more emotion than anyone, but his voice could carry more emotions than anyone Marlot knew. He wouldn't react if Marlot started the car and laughed, but his father would find a way to tell him how much of a disappointment he was. Marlot remembered that tone very well, how frigid it could be. Marlot shivered. It's going to be fine, Tremor said. Marlot nodded and hoped his lion was right. He got out of the car and locked it out of a habit. For the first time, it occurred to him he didn't used to lock his car when he lived here. Tremor and he walked to the door under his father's cool gaze. Marlot, the older wolf said, his tone giving no indication if he was happy to see him or not. It's good of you to come to visit. He nodded to the lion, blowing smoke away from them. Who is this? Marlot sniffed discreetly, trying to gauge his father's mood, but as usual his scent didn't give anything away. This is our eye Trembor Goldenmane. Trembor, this is my father, Kalis Blackclaw. It's a pleasure to meet you, Trembor said. Kalis nodded. They're inside. Dinner's almost ready. He took a drag on his pipe. I'll be in shortly. Marlot nodded and entered the house. The smell of old wood, paper, and spices made him smile. He'd missed this, he realized, coming home to eat, even when he lived on his own in town. He'd come home regularly to eat with his family. He hadn't expected too long for those times, since dinner wasn't the warm affair Trembor's family had. Put their coats in the closet, and then led him past his father's office and the family room, which faced it. The walls were brighter than he remembered, a more vibrant brown than they had been the last time he'd been here. Had his father actually given in and gotten the inside repainted? It didn't smell like it. They entered the dining room with its antique table and chairs, the only thing with any warmth to it in the house. They'd belonged to his mother's grandparent, given to her when she mated his father. The walls had a few portraits, a young Kalis standing before his parents, both of his parents holding a cub, himself, another where they were holding his sisters, and some more of them growing up. Each picture felt posed, showing people, but nothing of life. His gaze stopped on another wolf seated at a table, talking with his sister. She was a head taller, muscular, and pale blue shirt, and the pale blue shirt and pants brought out her russet fur. Finian? Marlot asked. She smiled and stood. Marlot, I'm so glad to see you again. She hugged him, and it took an effort for Marlot not to stiffen. I'd heard you were back. You're investigating Naego's death? Arleon requested it. He took a step back and looked at her. She still looked good. What are you doing here? Your mother invited me. She said you'd mention me to her and that it would be. She trailed off. You didn't mention me, did you? Sorry, I barely talked with her. I've been too busy with the investigation to really think about the past. And that's why I invited her. A woman said, coming out of the kitchen. She had molted brown fur and wore a gray dress under an apron. You're spending too much time working. You need to see your old friend. Who's this? She asked, eyeing the lion. Mother, this is Trembor Golden Mane. He's an RI like me and my partner. He's helping with Diego's death. Trembor, this is Jugalin, my mother. It's a pleasure to meet you, the lion said. His mother couldn't seem to find something to say for a moment. She turned and headed back to the kitchen. Marlot, why don't you come help me? Of course, he answered. Even if he didn't want to, he knew it was coming. I'll be right back, he said to the others in the dining room. She closed the door behind him. Why did you bring him? Her voice was low, but barely on this side of anger. What did you expect me to do, mother? He replied, keeping his voice at her level, but not letting his annoyance show. That would only make her angrier. I couldn't just ask him to stay in the room by himself. I'm the only one he knows here. Do you really expect me to be uncharitable and abandon him? He came here to help me. Of course, if his mother hadn't also invited his one-time interest to eat with them, she wouldn't be having this strong of a reaction. Marlot knew what she was attempting to do. She hoped that Finian would get him to stay. So Trembor was a threat to that, someone who could pull him back to the city, even if she didn't know how close they were. Her anger morphed into indignation. Of course not. I raised you better than that. I just wish you'd told me about him. I would have baked an extra pie. Marlot knew her too well to believe that, but he didn't call her on it. This wasn't like before, when he'd have to live with her trying to manipulate his life. He'd be out of here soon enough. I'm sorry. I didn't think about it when we talked, and then Dahlia met him. I figured she'd mention him. She did, but I didn't think. She forced a smile. I'm glad to see the city hasn't turned you into one of those cold people who only thinks about himself. He bit his lip to keep the comment that came to him from flying out. When he had control of himself, he said, You raised me better than that. He looked around. The kitchen was clean. There was no indication she'd done any baking, except for the two large pies on the counter. Do you actually need my help with anything? She handed him a can of Aaronberry sauce. Heat that, please. While that happened, she divided the pies into 6 pieces and placed them on plates. She drizzled the warm sauce over the meat and pastry preparation. The sweetness will go well with the spiciness, she commented. Marlot began to salivate. His mother had many faults, but she loved baking and was good at it. He'd loved watching her in the kitchen when he'd been a cub. One of the rare times he remembered seeing her smile. She looked over the plate, not entirely satisfied. You'll have to do, she said, handing him mitts so he could carry plates and not leave fur all over them. His father was placing an extra chair at the table when they joined them. He indicated for Trembor to sit next to Dahlia. Marlot almost protested, but caught himself. What could he say that wouldn't give something away? The arrangement might have been his mother's idea, but his father was on board with it. They were both hoping he and Finian would rekindle what they once had. Finian took over her father's garage, Gillis said once they were seated. His mother had bought 2 large pitchers of blood and glasses for everyone. I didn't think he'd retire this early. Marlot breathed in the aromas and couldn't wait to begin eating. It wasn't the plan, she replied, waiting for Gillis to start eating, like they all were. My family has a history of heart problems, so Naego told him to take it easy. He still manages the shop, but I do most of the work. She paused as Gillis picked up his fork. The patriarch took a bite of the meat pie, closed his eyes in contentment, and nodded to his mate. For the next minutes, the only sound was that of eating. Is it common for investigator to work in pairs in the city? Or you worked alone here, so but I guess there's a lot more to do there. No, it isn't, Marlot answered between bites. We're the only ones. Really? His mother asked. How did you two meet? Because of Roxel? Marlot busied himself eating instead of acknowledging his mother's tilted ears. This is very good, Trevor said. That was the hunter Marlot followed to the city. Roxel had left bodies in dozens of territories, so city leader Sharphorn called on all of us to work together to capture him. Normally, we're not allowed to get involved in death outside our territories, but they suspended that rule for the duration. First time in my career it ever happened. We all worked together. It didn't matter that Marlowe wasn't local. He joined in and I ended up working with him. We work well together, so we decided to continue working together when we realized the territory he took over was adjacent to mine. Marlowe was impressed with the ease his lion had stalked around some of the truth, like the fact that Marlowe had purposely picked the territory next to Trembor, or that the reason they'd worked together while hunting Ruxel had more to do with the one hot night the two of them had spent trapped in that basement. Doesn't sharing profit mean you get less? Killis asked. Trevor shook his head. We get more done together than on our own. Your son is adept with computers and he handles that side of the searches. I'm old school, claws on the ground, following scents. Within the year of helping me, we cleared out most of the bodies from my freezer. His father nodded. Morrow always had a good head for business. That's why I thought he'd take over managing the commune when I was gone. Marlowe didn't sigh. He shoved the fork full of food in his mouth to make sure he wouldn't. That had been one of the many reasons he'd left the town. His father's constant reminder that Tremor had disrupted his plan for him. He twitched when Finian brought a napkin to his lips. You have some sauce there, she said, smiling at him. Malot also noticed she'd moved the chair closer to his. He wanted to push away, but his mother was watching them, so he kept himself from reacting at all. His father looked at them, but if he noticed what was happening, he didn't show it. Finian, has there been any news on the new tractors? She placed her napkin down and leaned against Marlot. They're going to be in next month, so you can see them then. If you don't want to store them over to store them over to store them yourself over the winter, I'll make sure I get a new batch before the spring so I can tune them up for you in time for the planting. His mother reached across the table and placed a hand on his. Finian has been making a name for herself by convincing the manufacturers to sell through her instead of through that representative of theirs. What was his name? She asked. Progibum, his father answered between bites. She nodded. Can you imagine having to buy from a squirrel? Finian is going to do much better. She smiled at him. She's going to go far, you can be sure of that. Finian stood a little straighter and looked at Marlot. They didn't believe me when I said I could double their sales, but then I pointed out that since I do the repairs, I know who's in need of a replacement. It helps that you're one of us, Keller said. His mother nodded. Can't expect a squirrel to know anything about running a commune. Marlot glanced at his lion, who was keeping his face neutral as he ate. His mother squeezed his arm, forcing his attention back to her. Finian has made her father a lot of money, and I'm sure that even the surrounding towns will buy through her soon enough. Marlowe translated. Finian was now wealthy enough to be worth approaching. Having the two families attached through a meeting would give them a direct line to the sellers. This wasn't just about getting him to stay. His mother was looking to improve the commune's bottom line too. His father might be the one officially running it, but she wasn't about using her cunning to help. Your father must be very proud, Balot said in a neutral voice. Finian smiled and beamed, as if he'd given her a compliment. Mother, Dahlia told me she was interested in a male. What did you think of him? He, the question sent his mother gushing about the male, and Margot got a family name, Sleekbelt. His sister gave him a warning glare as soon as the name was out of her mother's mouth. She didn't have to worry. He wasn't planning on looking very hard. He didn't want to give his parents any reason to think he was interested in being part of the community again. Then Killis talked about how well the commune was doing, giving him a rundown of the production. His mother pointed out that there had been enough of a population growth among the farmers that they were going to expand the commune's territory the next planting season. When prodded by them, Marlowe spoke about his and Trimber's work, about how they They constantly closed a higher percentage of cases than the other investigators in the city. Unlike his father, he didn't like talking numbers. It made him feel like he was bragging. Through it all, Finian kept her hand near his arm, or once on his thigh. When he spoke, she looked at him like he was the most interesting person in the world. It was almost enough to destroy Marlot's appetite, but his mother had taken the time to make it, and as usual, it was delicious, so he was able to finish eating. Once the meal was over, his mother tried to convince him to stay. Your friend can come pick you up in the morning, she said. Marlot declined, saying they were heading back to work. His mother's disappointment was loud, while his father didn't show anything as they said their goodbyes. Marlot had just turned the car around and was heading down the driveway when Trembor looked at him. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Finian was making the moves on you, wasn't she? Marlot sighed. She was. She's the only female I've ever shown an interest in. Now our family's position in the town has improved, and with her access to the manufacturer, my mother's hoping that we'll get together. So it was a business decision for her. That and a way to keep me in town. Finian seems to be interested in me, although she might just be hoping for a way into my family. Would you do it? Trembor asked. What? Of course not. I'm with you. What if I wasn't here, if you hadn't left the town? Olive focused on his driving to give himself time to figure out an answer. I don't know, he finally said. I told you about my encounters with a prowler, right? You told me it happened, but you didn't give any details. Marlot nodded. He hadn't wanted to talk about that time before, but now that he and Trembor were together, he should be sharing more of himself. As you would expect, I was coming into my heat. You know how it goes, that first time you start noticing others sexually. You mentioned you only noticed males, though I know you mentioned you only noticed male though. I noticed both, but because of what happened with Margelo, I wasn't going to get close to any males. Finian caught my interest, and I started spending more time with her, but I'm sure she and I started spending more and more time with her. I'm sure she would have been the one, but he didn't say anything, then sighed. Her name was Brosselin Longreach. She was a wolf, and she approached me on the way back from the academy. He usually ran home, but I'd seen her in town. She runs the clothing store. She was driving and offered to give me a ride. I should have said no, but her scent was intoxicating. Chuckled, although there was no mirth in it. She had me out of my clothes in under 5 minutes. I had no idea what was going on, but I wanted more, and she was more than happy to give me as much as I could take. Stopped the car in the parking spot before their room. For the next 3 months, if I wasn't at the academy, I was with her, usually in her bed. She treated me like I was a king. At least that's what it felt like back then. I get it now that she was stroking my ego, so I'd perform for her, and did I ever? Then the heat waned and my desires calmed down. Of course, I didn't know that was the only thing keeping her interested. I thought we were in love. I would have signed my lifetime mating contract on the spot. He looked out of the car. The first time I didn't feel like performing for her, she kicked me out. I didn't understand. It would be years before I worked out what had happened, I didn't. But I haven't been interested in females since her. I didn't give Finian a second look after that, not in all my years living here. He shut the engine down. Even in this city, I don't think I looked at a female sexually once. So, no, I don't think I'd consider mating her, even if you weren't in my life. He got out of the car, locking it once Tremor was also out. Inside the room, he made sure the blinds were completely blocked. He made sure the blinds completely blocked the outside view. Then he took his lion to bed and had a night of passion that burned the memories away. And this concludes chapter 12 of A Familiar Death. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the book as well as the others in the series, they are available on all major e-retailers. If you want to support me, that's on my Patreon. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.